Okay, friends, my name is Dan Petrell, Senior Director of Maryland Realtors, of the Communications Program for Maryland Realtors. We are very excited to be bringing you this webinar. It will be moderated by our own CEO, Chuck Kasky. We encourage your questions, but questions will be answered at the end of our guest, Jessica Lautz, presentation about the profile of buyers and sellers. So please post your questions, and we will make sure to get them to Jessica at the question and answer period. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Chuck, who will introduce Jessica, and we'll go from there.
Thank you, Dan, and good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us. If I can see the names, keeps growing, so hopefully more people will be joining us. You're in for a real treat today. Dr. Jessica Lautz is Vice President of Demographics and Behavioral Insights, I love that title, at the National Association of Realtors. The core of her research focuses on analyzing trends for both NAR members and housing consumers. Through management of surveys, focus groups, and data analysis, she presents new and innovative ways to showcase results. And you'll see a lot of that today. Jessica received her doctorate of real estate from Nottingham Trent University in the UK. She also has a master's in public policy from American University and an undergraduate degrees, plural, in political science and law and justice from Central Washington University. I just wanted to make sure that everyone understood that the full report is available for free under the Right Tools Right Now program. It would normally be a cost, but if you go to the Realtor store and log in, even if you try to purchase it, it'll tell you you're not getting the member price. You log in and you receive the member price, which is $0. I downloaded it yesterday. I got through, it was a nice rainy day. I curled up with a cup of tea, got through 180 pages, and I find it endlessly fascinating. I promise you, you will gain tremendous amount of insight in what our buyers and sellers are actually looking for. So I'm excited to hear more from Jessica. And again, this is the first view, the first look. So we are beyond thrilled to have you and to have gotten you to give us this first look. And there's a great story about why she's in her car. I'll let her tell it. But without further ado, Dr. Lautz, thank you. Thanks again for coming.
Thank you so much, truly, for having me. So yes, I am going to show you the first look of the Profile of Home Buyers and Sellers report, which is absolutely, truly my favorite report. I will explain why in the world I am in a Walmart parking lot right now in Tennessee. I had a small house fire. My dryer vent never vented outside, apparently, and my house was built 80 years ago for World War II housing. I actually live close to the Pentagon in Arlington, Virginia. But that being said, I have 4 cats, I have a dog, I have a husband and a sister, and we all needed Wi-Fi. So we found a cabin in Tennessee. We moved on down here while our house got remodeled so that we could have a working washer and dryer, which required a lot more than you probably want to know about washers and dryers and the venting system. But I lost Wi-Fi about 2 hours ago. We kept hoping it would come back. There is absolutely no cell service up where the cabin is. So I'm running my presentation on a hotspot on my iPad to my laptop in the Walmart parking lot. So please do bear with me. I hope I do not drop off. If I do, I am going to try my darndest to get back on, but I will make sure that you guys have the PowerPoint regardless. And the most important thing is that the report is available for free under Right Tools Right Now. You can access it through nar.realtor, go to the Realtor store, the Profile of Home Buyers and Sellers, and yes, log in and it's completely free. And that's the most important part that you can take away, honestly, because I'm going to be sharing a lot of data. Much of it is from the Profile of Home Buyers and Sellers. Other data that I'm going to be sharing is new data that we have out as well. So I titled my presentation, America Moves When the Pressure Cooker Dings. before I had ever decided that I would do a PowerPoint presentation from a Walmart parking lot in the Tennessee area outside of the Cherokee National Forest. I did not know I was going to be here, obviously, but I think we are all in a pressure cooker situation. Regardless of where our work is, many of us have kids who are homeschooling. Many of us have an adult relative who's suddenly living with us, or that we haven't seen for months or weeks. And many of us are in a much different living situation with COVID. So we're absolutely in a pressure cooker. And what is happening is that a lot of people are saying, I have to move. This living situation is not doable for me. I cannot live here for an extended period of time. So in looking at, and I want to give just the landscape of what we're seeing in housing stats right now, and I'm gonna give some Maryland stats, but I have to say that every realtor knows their local market way better than I will ever understand and know your local market. So I'm giving an overview just to provide some background before we go into some consumer data that we have. So in here, when we look at the national housing landscape, what we see in this environment right now is the highest home sales that we've actually had since 2006. It's truly extraordinary. We did not expect the rebound that we have had in housing to go so far past a V-shaped recovery that it has. And it truly is past a V-shaped recovery at this point. We did see a deep dive down in the spring, but we are back and far surpassing that. We have 103 months of year-over-year home price growth. This is the long period of time that we have had this type of home price growth ever that we have recorded back to the 1960s. We've never recorded this length of time. As of this morning, we released our Metro quarterly data that we do on a quarterly basis. And what we have seen is that in every single MSA, we actually have year-over-year home price growth. Again, just completely an unprecedented time where the demand is far outpacing the amount of inventory that we have on the market. What's happening is that we have the shortest list to contract time, again, that we've ever recorded, really just breaking all barriers when we are reporting these numbers out. Really an extraordinary moment. We are seeing that 3 in 5 members are saying the market is hotter than normal, especially when we think about this time of year, past Labor Day, past Halloween, heading into the holidays. It would not be typical that you would have this much buyer demand. When we look at the Maryland market, what we see is, yes, inventory is tight. We see affordability is tough outside of even outside of the DC area. When we look at the MSA, includes DC, Maryland, Northern Virginia, West Virginia, what we see from Q3 to Q3 is nearly 12% price growth on an annual basis. That is very, very high, seeing double digits there. We also put out a new report. It's called a work from home report. I think this is pretty cool. We assigned a score to every county in America. There's a lot of counties. When we look at just the state of Maryland, what we see is that for Howard, Montgomery, Frederick counties, these have higher than traditional work from home scores. Good internet, Wi-Fi, better than I have in this cabin. And certainly a lot of people who are able to work from home and to work remote in their career. So we do see a lot of that happening as well, which means that there's a lot of people looking for that home office, a lot of people looking for 2 home offices, place to homeschool kids, and be able to do this right now at home. All right. The first consumer data I'm going to give you is not from the Profile of Home Buyers and Sellers. I'm slow playing it a little here, but truly, I think that this is important to understand too. We have been doing consumer research since the beginning of the pandemic, and we've been doing it in waves. This is fascinating data. This is also free under Right Tools right now. So if you log into the website, you can grab all of the latest data on this. There's also PowerPoint presentations and webinars that you can download on this data as well. This consumer data is fascinating because it actually asks consumers, given COVID, would you be willing to go on a home tour right now? Do you consider this a safe activity? This survey is really interesting because it was actually done in conjunction with other industries. So sporting events, movie theaters, going on a cruise, things that people probably wouldn't feel okay doing right now. And it compared that activity, the willingness to do them, in comparison to actually going on a home tour. And what we found is that going on a home tour is incredibly strong. I have to credit realtors out there for really making this a safe activity to happen, because what we saw is that V-shaped recovery. What we saw is a lot of demand of people saying, yes, I feel okay actually going and doing this. And so this really has led into this type of recovery, is making it safe, having masks, wearing gloves, having shoe coverings even. well before this was a national standard, or well before it was a state or local standard that we were seeing. We were really seeing entrepreneurs in the real estate industry embracing these practices first. The other thing that we're seeing here is that, yes, I'm remodeling my home kind of because I have to, but we also saw that a lot of Americans are remodeling their homes right now. The important thing to understand here is we wanted to know, is this going to lead them into actually deciding to move, or is this going to lead them into embracing their home and loving it more? What we have found is that 55% are actually saying, I'm doing this for the quality of my own home, but about a third of remodelers are actually saying they're making it more attractive to sell in the future. That's really important, as we know that inventory is tight. We know that housing stock is old, and we know people have been in their homes for a very long period of time, and they probably need to make some improvements before they put that home on the market. Now, the other thing that we have done in conjunction with this is we've actually surveyed members, and we've asked them various questions as well. What we have found over this time period during the pandemic is that half of members are actually working with potential sellers to show them ways to fix up their home for sale before their home's on the market. That's a pretty high share of members who are saying that they are doing this activity right now. The other thing I think is really important to talk about before we jump into some other data here is that a quarter of Americans right now are actually considering a second home. When we look at the profile home buyers and sellers, we are looking at primary residence buyers. So adding in this other research from this Engagius is really good, because then we can understand all of the market trends that we're seeing right now. We are seeing a lot of people saying, I'm cutting entertainment on going out to restaurants or to movies or to sporting events, and I have a lot more disposable income, especially among wealthier Americans. When we talk about and we hear about this K-shaped recovery, we see a lot of Americans are doing significantly better than they actually had been pre-pandemic, and those Americans are the ones who are considering second homes. What's happening is that it's very interesting, because some of these areas that have been traditionally only seasonally based are actually very popular now, looking at the second home market being more popular at different times of year, so almost year round as opposed to just seasonally based. Another question that we asked here is we wanted to understand why people were actually seeking to relocate, especially if they're moving more than 50 miles away. That's not necessarily just looking for a bigger home, that's a different location. We have seen that enjoying better weather, obviously top of the list, but we also see lessening the risk of COVID is very high there. And this has been high throughout the pandemic, as people say, I need less density in the location that I'm living, I need more personal space. We also see avoiding social unrest has actually been very consistent in the data. We're seeing about 20% of Americans are actually saying, I need to be in a different location, I want a different location to avoid the protests that perhaps are going on. I think this is a very, very fascinating number, and something that we've actually collected since about the end of June, beginning of July. The other thing that we're seeing here is 21% are saying, I want to leave the area that I'm in because of the political views of my personal political views may not match up with my neighbors. I think that's a very interesting trend too. Before we jump in too much into the profile home buyers and sellers, I do want to show you some of the data, how the protests relate to housing. I know that there's more protests, especially expected in the DC area over the weekend, but I do think it's important to understand how some of the early protest activity did relate to housing, where that connection is there too. And I'll show you some of the profile home buyers and sellers data throughout this as well. When we look at the homeownership rate by race, what we see is that there is a very large differential here. When we look at the homeownership rate today, what we see is that the gap between non-Hispanic white Americans and Black African Americans is actually wider now than before the Fair Housing Act started in 1968, when it was legal to discriminate based on race in housing. This is a very extraordinary phenomenon that has happened. This is a very long phenomenon that has happened. I am not going to go through all of the history here. There is absolutely some good literature that's out there that I would definitely recommend, like The Color of Law, that really dives deep into this. But I do think it's important to understand that the homeownership rate for Black Americans and for Hispanic Latino Americans was artificially pushed up during the boom years. And then what we saw was that those Americans lost their homes at double the rate of white Americans during the bust years. A lot of this has become cyclical, as we know that families rely on family members for down payment assistance, and that that's not actually available for many people out there, especially with the lost housing wealth that happened during the bust years. The other thing then, this is from the new profile of home buyers and sellers, and we've been collecting data on this for a number of years, but we wanted to know, even among successful home buyers who eventually did get into a home, who did purchase a home in the last year, what was the rejection rate for mortgages? What we find is that for African Americans, 10% of successful home buyers were actually rejected by a mortgage application in the process, compared to just 4% of white Caucasians. Now, there is a host of reasons of why the homeownership rate gap is as wide as it is, but this is one of the many reasons. We know that African Americans apply for mortgages at a smaller share, about half of what white Americans do, but then they're also rejected from mortgages at double the share of white Americans. This is one of the data points that does lead into that gap. And again, there's a number of other reasons. But I do think it's important to just look at among successful home buyers who said, you know, my debt to income ratio is good. I have a solid income. I'm going to go find a different lender who will actually approve me for that mortgage. And they did go forward with that process. When we look at the homeownership rate gap, I think the big takeaway here for me is that it's not only a gap of homeownership, it's a wealth gap in America. The number one way that Americans build wealth is truly through their home. It is very, very hard to save, and people are traditionally pretty bad at it. And what we find is that the home is the number one way where we do build wealth, even if our home means everything to us right now and truly a place where we're spending nearly 24/7. We do find that people really build their wealth through their home. And when we look at the net worth gap for families, what we see is that for white non-Hispanic families, their net worth is nearly $190,000 in comparison to Black African-American families, where their net worth is below $25,000. So again, that homeownership gap really translating into that net worth gap that becomes a cyclical issue for families to pass on that equity, that wealth to future generations, and the knowledge of homeownership as well. All right, so now I'm going to jump into a lot of demographic changes that are happening that we picked up in the profile of home buyers and sellers this year. We suspected that we were going to see, and we absolutely did see them this year. So the profile of home buyers and sellers, to back up, to give you a little baseline here, this is a report that NAR has been doing since 1981. It is 39 years old. I think it's an incredible report because what it does is it looks at buyers and sellers in real time and says, who are the people who purchased last year? What are their reasons? What's their relationship with their agent? What do they want out of their agent? The report is 185 pages long this year. It is extraordinarily long. When we look back at the 1981 version, we still have a hard copy in the office, and it's really about 20 pages long. So it has expanded over time. It's a resource not only for members, but a lot of academics use it as well as a wealth of a data set that actually predates a lot of the census data in homeownership and housing and demographics as well. So, all right, let's jump into this. Let's talk about a lot of the changes that are happening right now. One of the big one that is truly fascinating is that 52%, and this is census data, 52% of Americans right now have a 19 to 29-year-old who is living at home with them. This is the largest share that America has ever recorded since the Great Depression. That is a very high number, 52% of young adults living at home with their family. There's a lot of reasons behind that. College went online, college went hybrid. People had the opportunity to have a gap year this year instead of going online to college or to physically going to a space where they wouldn't actually attend classes. Young professionals who actually are even married have moved back home with their parents who are saying, you know, if I'm in a quarantine, if I'm going to work from home, why am I renting this really expensive apartment? Let me just go home, even to a different city, and live with my family members right now and save on that rent cost. And then I can actually see my family. So a lot of motivations behind this, but it absolutely is translating into housing. When we look at buyers who purchased during the pandemic, what we have seen is that 1 in 6 are purchasing a multi-generational home. About 15% are purchasing a multi-generational home. In comparison, before the pandemic, we saw 11% of buyers were purchasing a multi-generational home. Really seeing this increase. The number one reason that we are seeing this is because aging relatives who perhaps were living independently or in a senior center situation are now at home. This is a very big implication for housing because those adults who perhaps were in a senior care center or in some sort of assisted living facility probably did have safety precautions there in those facilities that are probably not likely to have with the housing stock that America has today. Big implications here for what that means for those adults. The other big thing here we see, again, is these young adults moving home and families actually saying, wow, this is not something I expected. Maybe I'd already downsized or had planned on it. This is certainly not something I can do now. I actually need a bigger home that will accommodate everyone here. We also see about a third of multi-generational buyers, and I know this adds up to more than 100 because you could have multiple reasons here. More than a third are actually saying, I need cost savings, I need to split utility costs, mortgage costs here, but also this allows me to purchase a larger home than I would have before. So a lot of different reasons really feeding into this and into these families, but this is a big, big change and definitely an increase in acceleration of past trends, but a very steep acceleration just looking into the last few months. And when I say before COVID and after or during COVID, what we did with this year's data set is the data is collected from the middle of the summer of 2019 to the middle of the summer of 2020. So anyone who closed on their transaction in April and beyond were included in this during COVID buyer set. This is interesting because it is kind of at the beginning of the pandemic. We don't really know where the middle is, but I would say it's early in the pandemic. So they may have actually been searching for a home before COVID ever hit, but they closed on their transaction or April or later because they would have been impacted in some degree by COVID. When you think about those transactions back in April, just delays that they may have had in that closing process, the search process probably a little different. So the other big demographic trend that has been talked a lot about is potentially this big baby boom that's going to happen after the pandemic. We're going to see a lot of little girls named Pandemica, kindergarten classes full of them. I do not buy this. We have had in the country a massive baby bust. There has been more than 35-year lows in birth rates in the US. People are not having children like they used to. They cannot afford to. We really do see that birth rates have gone down astronomically. When we see this, there's other survey research that's out there that indicates the reason why is it's too expensive. $2,000 per month for daycare is way out of reach for many Americans to be able even to consider that. So we've seen that birth rate drop. Looking at this, what we see on this particular chart is we're looking at people who purchased a home with a child in the home who's under the age of 18. Looking back at 1985, 58% of families did have a child under the age of 18 when they purchased. Today, it's the lowest we've ever recorded at 33%. That has a massive implication. One, when we think about schools, the priority of schools, the distance to the school, the quality of the school, it's going to be less important to home buyers overall because they're less likely to have children. Period. That's just has to be a factor there. But also when we think about that space in the home office, obviously so important, that personal space within the home that we all are yearning for right now. But it may not matter as much if you don't have two children in that home who also need their own personal space and their own homeschooling space. Pretty big implications here for housing and what is needed in that house and where that house is located. All right, so this is a much lighter note, but we absolutely see this in the data. We started collecting this about 3 years ago, and we have seen very consistently that pets matter. We have a separate report called Animal Health, but much of the data we do pull from the profile of home buyers and sellers. This year, similar to past years, when we collected this data, what we found, and these are all the pets in my home. This is why we had to drive a million hours away to a cabin that will take 4 cats and a dog, because that's insanity. I get that. I know that. When we look at this, what we see is that for animal owners, it is more important for unmarried couples, for single females, to be close to the dog park, to be close to pet facilities like vets, than it actually is to be close to good schools. It's more important to them. We absolutely see that this actually becomes a reason why pet owners buy. They don't want to pay pet rent. They'd rather have their own house that will accommodate their animals. And we also see that they're actually choosing the location of where they buy as well. So really is leading in to these buyers, really is a driving motivation, especially if they have more than one animal, really becomes important. We're seeing this as a higher importance in rural areas, in urban areas, places perhaps where urban areas where you really do need to find an HOA or a condo that will accept the weight of your dog, the number of animals that you have, really becoming important in your choice of where you're buying. All right, so this I think is a really fascinating trend. When we look back at the 1960s, what we see is that more than 70% of American adults were married. Today, just half of American adults are married. So there's a lot of reasons behind this. Some of that is that millennials, who are the largest adult generation in the US, are getting married at later ages. So that's one of the big trends. The other big trend is that we actually see a graying of divorce. People wait for their kids to go to college, and then we actually see divorces happening as people hit a later age. So we do see that happening. We just see a lot of people moving away from the institution of marriage too. That's just a statement. I'm going to put it out there, but it is true. And we do see this happening. When we look at home buyers today, especially first-time home buyers, we really see this pronounced trend. Back in the 1980s, 75% of home buyers were married couples. Today, it's just a little more than half. We've seen this really drop down in recent years. Last year, it was at 53%. So we're seeing this incremental drop in first-time home buyers who are married. What we have seen on the flip side is that singles have actually risen. Single females have been second only to married couples since the beginning of this report. When we look overall at all buyers, single females making a lot of financial sacrifices, traditionally having less income as home buyers, and as single women overall, we see that they are willing to make these financial sacrifices to get into homeownership, even taking on a second job to be able to save for this down payment. We did see a big push of single females during the boom years. We have seen them trail off in recent years, but we saw this rebound this year. Pretty exciting to see 19% of overall first-time home buyers are single females. Overall, for repeat buyers, also seeing a rebound here as well. The other big thing that we're seeing is that unmarried couples are at 16%. It's not the highest we've ever recorded. We had the highest last year at 17%, but we really are seeing this very large push of unmarried couples making the biggest financial purchase of their life as an unmarried couple. I think it's a fascinating trend we absolutely are seeing. Single males, they're there, but they're only at 11%. We have seen them move up in recent years, but they always trail behind these single female buyers. The other thing that we are seeing is this other category. I like to call it the Golden Girls phenomenon. We have been seeing a rise in this in recent years. We did see a drop off this year at 3%. But actually for buyers who purchased during COVID, we actually saw a rise in unmarried couples and a rise in this other category. I think it's pretty fascinating. What we are seeing is that people are pooling their incomes. They had been renting perhaps together and are saying, I'm tired of renting. Let's go buy a house together. And they are going and doing it. Really, really fascinating trend. I would say for unmarried couples, for that other category, I am not an attorney, but I would definitely say a legal agreement probably needs to be in place, because what happens if that relationship dissolves? What happens if you go and find as a roommate, hey, I'm going to partner up with someone and go buy a house with that person, a job change, etc., that you wouldn't probably consider as a roommate, at least, really taking your roommate into account in that. All right. Another big trend that we saw in this year's report, this is an unfortunate one to me. First-time homebuyers have dropped to a 33-year low. It is as low as in 1987, nearly as low when it was at 30%. The historical norm for first-time homebuyers, where we want to see it for primary residence buyers, is at 40%. So really seeing this drop off this year, disappointing. Even looking at those who purchased during COVID with these extraordinarily low interest rates, we still have seen this drop. There really was not a difference, unfortunately. It could be in recent months. We are seeing a difference, especially as people look at these more affordable areas, not being wedded to an office location in an expensive city center. perhaps we will see the first-time home buyer rate rise next year, but we have not seen it yet in the data. That 50% mark, that's when we had that first-time home buyer tax credit. It pushed a lot of first-time home buyers into the market, but unfortunately, we just have not, coming out of the Great Recession, seen this share rebound. They have a lot of hurdles, student loan debt being this one huge hurdle that a lot of younger buyers, millennials, do have. Even looking at successful first-time home buyers out there, about half actually do have student loan debt, and the typical amount is $30,000. So if you have student loan debt, even if it's not $30,000, that's going to be a pretty big hurdle to what you can actually afford to purchase. It's going to be really a big hurdle to your buying power, especially with these rising home prices. Looking at these double-digit rising prices in the DC metro area, at least year over year, that's going to be a problem for people to be able to enter that home buying market. I will say, when we look at student loan debt, this is a very interesting topic right now, because I have a question mark here. One of the very first stimulus packages that happened back in the spring is it actually brought student loan debt to a 0% interest rate. That's a big leg up for student loan debt holders. And the reason I really want to underscore that is that for 47% of student loan debt holders, pre-stimulus package, what we saw is that they were in a negative amortization loan. So they owed more the next quarter on their student loan debt than they did this quarter, even while making on-time payments. That's a really big problem. So with the 0% interest rate, if especially they move back home, they're a young professional who still is working, but working remote, this could be a really big leg up to a lot of student loan debt holders to really tackle that debt and pay it down. The other thing that happened with student loan debt is that it did automatically go into forbearance. So if they're not paying attention, or if they've lost their job, or they need to tackle other debt, they probably are just putting student loan debt on the back burner. So big question here, if this is going to help the first-time home buyer share moving forward. We haven't seen it yet, but it is possible. Maybe in 2021, we do see that that does help these adults with student loan debt. All right. A lot of seller data here. Some big changes for sellers who were actually making their transaction happen during COVID versus before COVID. We absolutely see that sellers are in a bigger rush right now in actually selling their home. They need another place to live. They're actually saying that they're willing to take incentives, even in the seller's market. We're at least seeing this in the data. Maybe it's not happening in your local area, but at least on a nationwide scale, what we are seeing is they were more willing to take incentives, especially when you look at the remodeling data, like giving a credit for remodeling. Something's broken in my home. I've owned this home for a longer period of time, and something needs to be fixed, but hiring a remodeler and putting this home sale on a stalling point for a couple months as something gets fixed is just not something I can do. So we are seeing that. We're also seeing home warranties are being offered, especially for sellers during COVID in comparison to before COVID. Even in the seller's market, I think these are really interesting trends. I think it really speaks to the older housing stock in America, but also that these people held onto their home for typically 10 years before selling. So a lot of these homes probably need something to be actually fixed up in it. Now with COVID, they're actually saying, I have to actually sell. I have to get out of here. I'm just willing to make this happen. The other thing that we did see in the data when we look at the overall national medians is that they were taking a price concession. So typically the sellers sold, we look at the entire year within 3 weeks, and they sold at 99% the list price. Now this is not that big of a difference, but sellers who sold during COVID sold for 98% the list price. Again, not that huge difference. And I know there are massive price escalations that are happening around the country right now, but I do think it's interesting if we think about just on a nationwide scale, there's probably some people who are saying, you know, I don't need to even get all of the price. I just need the quickest offer, the most secure offer to actually sell my home right now. The one big thing, though, is that these sellers who were selling during COVID actually sold for a higher price. Buyers bought at a higher price. They had higher incomes, both the buyers and the sellers actually had more equity in their home to start with. They probably owned their home for a longer period of time. They had the equity, and they were willing to actually do these things to get their home under contract pretty fast. Okay, let's talk about the agent use. This is some pretty interesting data as you go through the report. Chapter 4 and Chapter 7 really dive deep into this on both the buyer relationship and the seller relationship in this report. This is really important during COVID. Some of that really early data that I showed you in the presentation, that Engagius data, we actually did focus groups too. I think it was really fascinating, and I'll talk about some of the stories that we got from those focus groups as I go through this section. But I do think there's some really interesting takeaways that I did have in those focus groups, along with the profile of home buyers and sellers data. So looking at the buyer use of agent, we do see it's near all-time highs. It's at 88%. The highest we've ever recorded is at 89%. So really are seeing very strong use of agents. People really do want representation by their side. Now, we actually collect this report and we look at not only people who are actually purchasing existing homes, but also of new build homes. And what we see is that even if people are buying new construction, they actually want agent representation. So we do see a stronger share of that, and we have in past years as well. But we just see that building overall has gone down. So we see builders' use of an agent, only buying through them, has gone down as well. On the seller side, people want a full service agent. We're seeing that 89% of sellers did actually sell through an agent. They may have started both the buying and the selling side, their search process, their thinking process online, but they quickly transform into having representation on their side. This year, for the first year, we asked about iBuyers. It is less than 1%. We put it in the report, but it has an asterisk because there's not actually even reportable data to actually report. People are not using iBuyers. They may be using them in some regions of the country, but we are not picking it up in the data. It is very possible that they are pricing their home and understanding what they could sell it for with an iBuyer, but once they understand that, they are going with an agent. Some big things that I picked up in this report this year is that it's very interesting. I've said it a couple times, but the top reasons why people want an agent, what they want their seller's agent to do for them: sell within a specific time frame, price their home competitively, find this qualified buyer, get them out of their home. But what has moved up in the data is that people actually want an agent that will show them how to fix up their home for a sale. I think that's really, really fascinating, and something that sellers are starting to understand, perhaps as they binge watch HGTV, that this is something they need. The other thing that we have collected in the data, I think since 2006, I don't know if I have the exact year correct, but it's about mid-2000s, is we asked, do you want a full service agent? Do you want a limited service agent? Someone who will just list on the MLS? What kind of agent do you want? And what kind of agent did you use? What we found is that the highest share we've actually ever recorded, I believe it's 88% this year, actually used an agent who's going to use all the services, that broad range of services, not just a limited service agent. They don't just want someone who's going to list on the MLS. We also are seeing FSBOs at just 8% this year, historic lows. We've had it as high as 20% back in the 1990s, but really a very small share of people want to sell via FSBO today. They do not know how to price their home. They don't want to deal with having to set up all of the different listing presentations, having their home cleaned. They don't know what to do in this process. They really do want someone who's going to represent them. All right, so this is where I'm going to pause for a second and talk about some of this focus group data that we heard back as well. I'm going to say it was 4 focus groups, and they were full of anxiety. I know that everyone is super anxious right now. I know that everyone is in a pressure cooker situation, but these focus groups were really striking to me. On the seller side, especially, it was not just the normal anxiety of what happens if I get stuck with 2 homes and I have to pay 2 mortgages, what happens if I can't sell in time because I have a new job. It was not just that anxiety. That anxiety is the normal anxiety when people have a transaction to happen here. What they were also saying is they were very, very scared of being sick. They were very scared of COVID. They were very scared of buyers coming into their homes, and they weren't entirely sure if their agent, they were telling them, but they weren't entirely sure what was going on. I would just say to over communicate as much as possible. One of the sellers who was in the focus group, she was in the state of Florida, and she was talking about how she decided that she was going to stay during the listing presentations as the buyers came into the home. She would physically walk behind the buyers and wipe down everything the buyer touched with bleach wipes. I will say that it was very striking to me. I don't think I'd ever heard anything like that before. Obviously, we had no reason to ask questions like this before, but it is very, very striking to hear that from someone of what they were doing to protect themselves from COVID. So definitely the anxiety is there. It's very possible that we might be able to up the inventory that's out there right now if we disclose to sellers what in the world we're doing, that we're going to make the transaction as safe as possible, that these are what other people are doing too, and we want to make sure that both the buyers and the sellers stay safe in that transaction. All right. Looking at the Engage.ES data, we have asked some questions on this. This is the Engage.ES data, not the profile of home buyers and sellers. And what we asked is, do agents matter more now during the pandemic than they did before? And we found that absolutely yes, agents matter more during the pandemic than they even did before. Really, really interesting data, getting that back, hearing that from people that they really do want that representation. They do not feel comfortable doing this by themselves, especially in this anxiety-ridden situation. All right. So what's next? What in the world is next? I have no idea. I will say there's a lot of question marks on this chart, on this slide, because I don't know what's next. We are seeing a lot of indications that McMansions, the idea of McMansions, is probably going to come back. There's definitely the need for more space, the want for more space. The data that we're getting back, though, is suggesting a lot of people are used to living in very small condos and they just need outdoor space. So it's possible that the idea of tiny homes on land becomes popular. The idea of vacation homes, obviously a lot of Americans want to buy one right now if they can afford to. That's a big if. And they need good broadband access. And if they have those two things, what's keeping it from being their primary home? I think that's a big question mark that a lot of Americans might be grappling with right now, especially not having to go into a physical work location. The other big question mark, early retirement purchases. We're starting to get indications that even if retirement is 10, 15 years in the future, there's a lot of people who are saying, you know what? These are low interest rates. I have the ability to make this purchase right now. Why don't I go and purchase a retirement home right now? It'll be a vacation home in the temporary time period, but that's an early retirement home. If these things happen, if the data that we're getting back is correct and what we're seeing in the data is correct, I think there's going to be a reinvention of rural areas, traditional recreation areas, the idea of better broadband access, obviously high on everyone's list, but also just thinking about the commercial properties that are available, thinking about what's offered in these commercial areas for rural areas, for small towns, for traditionally recreation areas. If they were only seasonally based, maybe they're open year round now. That's a huge question mark, especially with COVID at play here. And then the question mark here, schools, a huge question mark. More than 70% of school children started remote. Some of those schools have opened back up. Some of them are hybrid. I think that's a huge question mark for families as they grapple with, essentially, I'm homeschooling my child. Do I have to be in a top tier school? Do I want to go to a private school? Where is best for my kid to go to school, for my own personal child, and what they need? And then a huge question mark here, a drop in tenure. We have not seen this in the data yet. And I will tell you that tenure in homes is at an all-time high of 10 years. People do not sell every 6 to 7 years like they had traditionally. When we look back at the data from the 1980s, they were holding onto their home for a record number of time, even for those who were selling during COVID. I will say, though, the big thing that we had seen here historically is that people sold their home because something in their life changed. They had a baby, they got married, they got divorced, and now this is not necessarily happening because we've seen marriage rates and birth rates drop. We've seen that people are holding onto their jobs for a longer period of time, so those factors are not coming into play. But I think we can all agree that COVID is the one thing that changed everyone's lives, so we really could see that tenure starts to drop. One of the big, very interesting things that we saw in the data points is that for those buyers who are purchasing right now, they had been saying, I'm going to hold on to this home for a record number of time. We've been collecting this data for about 10 years. And they said 15 years. I'm going to hold on to this home for 15 years. For those who purchased during COVID, they actually said, I'm only going to hold on to this home for 10 years. I just need to get into the perfect home for my family right now. Bigger space, bigger yard, whatever. And this is the home that's going to fit my needs for right now. After COVID, 10 years from now, I'll figure out the rest later. That's a very interesting trend to watch and see if it does drop. We would like to see it drop. We'd like to see more movement happening and the ability for these first-time home buyers to enter into first-time home buyer homes. All right. Looking at the economic forecast, I will tell you that Lawrence Yun will likely put out a new one next week because it is our annual convention and he has his economic and residential forum. It's on the 17th. If you have never listened to him before, please do tune in because he is an amazing presenter and will likely put out a new forecast next week at his residential session. So looking at his forecast for right now, what he does expect, and this is about 2 months old, his forecast, he hasn't revised it since then, is that the existing home sales continuing to see them increase into 2021, continuing to see price growth. Unfortunate for first-time home buyers who are trying to enter the market, but we do see those low interest rates continuing to stay as well. Definitely that is an encouragement for first-time home buyers if they're purchasing than they may have been looking at before. Unemployment rate, hopefully we'll see that continue to tick down with these really high COVID numbers. You know, I think that there could be some businesses who decide to close down or may be forced to close down through no fault of those employees. We may see a change in that, but I'm not entirely sure at this point. Are seeing for an annual figure of GDP, seeing GDP down. We did see some rebounds in GDP were released a couple of weeks ago, but truly not as steep as we need it to be to overcome the really deep record-breaking drop that we saw in the spring. For 2021, expecting the GDP to be positive moving forward. All right, so that was a lot of national data. We do have a state and local website. Please do check that out for your state and local data. Not all of this data is available there, but we do have other data that is cool, that's fun to play around with. It's all interactive. And then lastly, do follow us on social media, and most importantly, grab your free copy of the Profile of Home Buyers and Sellers that we do traditionally charge for this. So I'm so excited that we can actually put this out for free right now for the first time. So go to nar.realtor, click on the Realtor store, and then grab your free copy of the report. So thank you guys so much. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I think that Chuck is going to join back in for Q&A
Yes,
as well.
yes. Thank you so much, Jessica. This is Dan, and thank you for doing this from your car. That is really wonderful. While we wait for Chuck to join us, the first question we got in one of your earlier slides, you had a slide there from Q3 to Q3. Were you comparing the 2019 Q3 to this year's Q3?
Yes, I was. So looking from 2019 to 2020 Q3, looking at the home price growth in just the DC MSA area. And that data was released just this morning. So it's near a 12% growth. I think it's like 11.8 or something for the region.
Okay, great. Well, I'll go through another question that we had. A little while ago when you were showing your slides for home ownership and stuff, for the unmarried couple category that you had there, are you saying, Tracy wants to know, could they be just roommates and not couples in a relationship?
No, so we do ask it their household type. So that unmarried couple is truly unmarried couples. The other category is where you'd put the roommate in. So that's at 3% this year, but still seeing high numbers of both unmarried couples and that roommate category in recent years, especially.
Okay, okie dokie. Another question we have from Michael and Frederick. What do you anticipate happening with short sales and foreclosures? Do you see an increase, decrease? Do you see them staying the same?
So that's a really good question. Now, I will say that I'm going to refer one to the Census Pulse data that is looking at people who cannot pay rent or cannot pay their mortgage and expect that they won't be able to in the next 2 months. That's great data. They're putting it on a weekly level or a weekly basis, and it is on a state level data as well. So please do check out that data set. That being said, the idea that short sales and foreclosures could increase, I don't necessarily know that that's going to happen. There are some people who can't pay their mortgage right now. They've lost their job during this recession, not a fault of their own, just what the COVID environment is doing to many businesses. However, inventory is tight, and I think that they may be able to work something out and have a short sale as opposed to a foreclosure if it were to come to that, but they likely could list their home on the market if they knew that was coming down the road, and probably even sell for a profit given these high home prices and the low inventory. So I don't think that there's going to be this huge wave that we had in 2008. That was really a lot of bad lending that was going on that was really leading into that.
Wonderful. Well, you're getting a lot of thank yous from a lot of people on our membership. So thank you for that. Kimberly wants to know, what does GDP stand for? Again, I'm assuming that's gross domestic product.
It is, yeah. So that's basically all activity in the entire economy, from purchasing a stick of gum to buying a house. It's everything that happens in the economy during a given time period. And housing actually is about 18% of that on a national scale. So quite extraordinary.
Okie dokie. Let's see, what else do we have here from questions? There have been questions here about the link. Just so everybody knows, once Jessica, are you going to be sending me these slides today? Either today or tomorrow. I'll put the link up on the front of the Maryland Realtors website so people can access the report directly from there. I'll put the link there. But next week we will send out, by Tuesday, I would assume, links to this recording of this webinar and the slide deck that Jessica has provided. And Chuck, you're here. How would you, over to you.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks again, Jessica. It's great. I think anybody can pick out, go through it, find the things that interest you. There's a chapter on use of realtors, and I got a lot of insight from that. One thing that I found surprising is that it's roughly 50%, whether it's a married couple, single person, unmarried couple, want most from a real estate agent is help finding the home. Anecdotally, I would have always thought it was to negotiate the terms, to get through the paperwork. That was way down on the list. 13, 12, 8, less than 10% say help with the paperwork is why they are using a real estate professional. I was shocked by that.
Yeah, and so truly that's inventory. That is the lack of inventory that people are facing today, the difficulty of perhaps even putting down multiple contracts before they finally find their home. And that has actually risen in recent years. Yeah.
And also 40 to 50% find their agent by referral.
Yes, absolutely. Referrals, huge, especially actually looking at during COVID buyers and sellers. They really want someone they can trust. They really want someone who's honest, is reliable. Those are top factors really when finding an agent. And if someone you know had a good experience, they're going to work with that person.
Yeah. So again, any other questions?
I think we went through a lot of the questions. Everybody, I like Kay's response. She really appreciates Jessica's deep knowledge and way of presenting a lot of data and the trouble she went to us for today. We really do. And of course,
I am so sorry. This is not a room reader 10 right now, obviously.
Oh, I think it just shows how dedicated you are, and we really appreciate that.
And I think that you are an inspiration to our members, and they can totally relate to what MacGyvering, whatever it takes to get things to work. So good job, MacGyver.
Love that show.
I know, right? Yeah.
Well, I guess we will bring this to a close. Let me see. No more questions. Early next week, you will receive, all registrants will receive a link to the webinar and to the slide deck that Jessica will produce. But because she has a special link to get this report, look on our website and our Facebook page later today, and I will post a link to those for you to access this report. Jessica, thank you so much for your time. It's always a pleasure to see you, and I hope you have a very comfortable car. And thanks again. And thank you all for—
Thank you, guys. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
To all our participants for showing up today. We're going to have another webinar on December 3rd. We're working out the details, and stay tuned for that. Until then, have a great day. Jessica, get back to your cabin, and we will all have a wonderful day today. Best wishes, everyone. Bye.
Take care, everybody. Be safe.